We are sliding down a dangerous path. As indicated by the Kofi Annan Foundation, we are assured of violence next year. And it looks like we're already laying the ground with a fast-rising culture of political goonism.
Now, fellow Kenyans, I think we are trading in a very, very wrong direction as Kenyans, especially the games that these our leaders are playing. We've entered into the phase of goonism. Kitambo, we had got what is known as Mungiki. Right now, tumeingia kwa hii phase ya goonism, whereby goons are all over. Like politicians are also just stamping by saying that they cannot operate without goons. Goons ndio wanawatengenezea ground, according to the statement that was made yesterday in the morning by the acting SG of ODM, that is Honorable Me, that yes, they have goons. The only problem is that they use these goons in a wrong way. So I want you to listen to the news gang. Actually, yesterday night, they were just talking about this issue of goons, the way goons are taking over the country and all that. I would like you to listen to the conversation. Sam Gituku, Jamila, Yvonne Okwara, and of course Kai. The way they were talking about this, and then after listening to the whole thing, you also tell me what you think at the comment section. Because basically what we are witnessing right now, it's something that every Kenya is supposed to fear, because it's very dangerous. It's a very dangerous path that we don't really need to follow. What is the government saying concerning this? What is William Ruto saying concerning this? None of the above. Can we listen to this?
We are sliding down a dangerous path. As indicated by the Kofi Annan Foundation, we are assured of violence next year. And it looks like we're already laying the ground with a fast-rising culture of political goonism.
We are about to lose it, fellow Kenyans. This goons thing is no longer a light matter. Yet, all we see is a blame game and finger-pointing between government and opposition figures. They are playing ping-pong, and unfortunately, with real lives of Kenyans.
It wasn't me, they all say. But then, a Kenyan is dead or injured, all victims of violent, motivated, and presumably well-paid goons. For government, we must raise the flag of inaction or conspiracy. We asked here before, as we do again today, are we losing our formal institutions? And are these institutions being replaced by informal authorities?
Whatever the answer to that question, let us be reminded as Kenyans, we are not special, and neither are we immune to pitfalls of political fallacy. We could very well head the hate way, the irony of our peacekeeping mission there notwithstanding. There is Somalia, and there is Democratic Republic of Congo. Again, we are not special, we are not immune, and we have leaders perfectly capable of taking us there and faster than you can imagine.
Our politicians have demonstrated immense talent for disorder. They're gifted with perfect raw material necessary for the making of a failed state. They come bold and reckless in their words and deeds. Whether up a sunroof or in front of a church congregation, our current crop of politicians have proven themselves a ticking time bomb.
They speak so irresponsibly. We know they make television viewing in normal households an agonizing affair. They spew hatred and incite violence. And they have a good reason to. The foundation of impunity in this country is strong and unshakable. No one ever pays the price for such in this country.
Courtesy of our solid state of national impunity, two things stick out tonight like sore thumbs in Kenya's democratic story. The two things are force and violence. Both, unfortunately, appear increasingly entrenched and accepted almost as the norm in the conduct of politics.
Earlier today, we witnessed both violence and force at play. With typical consistency, political players and elements of state agencies delivered yet again. From charged crowds supposedly manning or protecting polling stations to overzealous gun-trotting security officers, the show of muscles took over from where the voters peacefully left early this morning. Kalou has just joined Kenya's list of case studies in what ought not to be.
Indeed, and it is becoming a disturbing political culture. Yet, we fear it is a culture that is quietly celebrated, especially in political circles. Goons are now becoming the norm rather than the exception. Politicians don't admit it, and neither does the state. But we know goons are valued political investments. Goons are not only paid, they're also protected from the law and protected from accountability.
That is why you may never know who was involved in the attack on a Linda Mwananchi convoy in Keumbu, Kisii County recently. And you remember that army of armed goons marching towards a church in Kisumu recently? And that striking similarity with the marches of the genocidal Interahamwe militia of Rwanda in 1994. That must be found particularly disturbing. As it is again, we are not special.
Fellow citizens, we are not living through the most responsible times in the history of our country. We are on a downward spiral with goons and fumbling formal institutions, the signature of our decline. The question is, who will stop this downhill rush?
Responsible Kenyan adults can stop this. The place of our formal institutions remains solid and intact in the pages of our Constitution. We have a simple recommendation as a starting point. The National Police Service should immediately move to reclaim the ground it lost to goons. Police, and not goons, must remain the symbols of our national quest for the rule of law and order.
Still on that starting point, political leaders should abandon the ill-advised doctrine of force and violence. As a multi-party democracy, Kenyans must embrace persuasion as the only currency of political trade. Brain, not blood. Ideas, not djembe sticks. Institutions, not goons. And ultimately, votes, not guns. For country, our joint first word.
Look, IEBC will not be miracle workers. They will not create an environment that they didn't find. The environment is very, very critical, and I think there are more players than just the IEBC for Kenyans to get right the next election. We've spoken about the culture of political goons, culture of violence, culture of misapplication of the role of security services, and in what I feel an increasing use of them in political assignments. I mean, what can IEBC do about goons? What can IEBC do about police officers who are trigger happy? What can IEBC do about pronouncements from political leaders that are actually insightful? And what can IEBC do about the lack of accountability when it comes to law enforcement? They don't have arresting powers. They cannot arrest goons. So I think IEBC will only be as good as the political environment that will be created ahead of 2027. But looking at all what I like calling midterm elections, because there is a term is 5 years, and then a president is eligible for one more term of 5 years. we've had a very, very troubled journey since 2007. Basically, all midterm elections have been problematic for this country. First, because they have been made life and death affairs. You know, that is why even this debate of one term, two term, is actually a life and death discussion for some. And you hear some politicians saying, no, nobody has ever been one term, so that will not happen. And you hear others saying, yeah, it is two term or nothing. So this end times kind of talk is what is problematic. And I always say it delays our maturity as a country. So you have a population that is very well informed, very well aware of their civic duties and all that, but you have a political culture that actually suppresses that kind of growth. I was watching earlier an interview done by one of the international media houses with the Speaker of the National Assembly in Senegal, Ousmane Sonko, who would actually have been president of Senegal had it not been the games of previous President Macky Sall to block him from running for president. And what Sonko did with his popularity, he basically brought in someone else in the form of Bassirou, Osman Bassirou as well, to run for president, and he's currently president. Then there was a fallout. These fallouts are all over. They run from east coast to west coast of Africa. And after the fallout, Ousmane Sonko, who was prime minister, resigns, or actually was removed. And then he found his way to becoming the Speaker of the National Assembly. There's something I was saying today that was really profound, that Senegal is a country ruled by a constitution and laws of the country and civility. I heard him using that word. And he said, you know, there should not be any fear that now that he is the president of the National Assembly or the Parliament of Senegal, there shouldn't be a problem that, you know, they'll push the country to the brink with his former boss, Bassirou. So there is maturity all around. I'm looking at the UK, next former prime minister, former prime minister of Britain actually began that journey to becoming the next former prime minister by yesterday taking his last prime minister questions.
Yes. PMQs, and then
his tribe was not outside the streets saying, you know, Mtuetu asitolewe, stay on.
Ngapi ni half term?
Yeah.
Because yake hata si one term, two term, half term, 2 years old.
Now remember, in the UK, there are even no terms. There are no terms. But I didn't know they can reduce that to 0. But now they're not doing anything. We've had, I think, four prime ministers in the last few years.
Yes.
And look at the transition.
Yeah.
And to our people in security, police and all that.
There were no police outside.
Yes.
Number 10 Downing Street.
Look at that number 10 Downing Street. Actually, normally.
It was only Larry the cat who was there.
Yes. So we need a national relaxing of shoulders. Some people are too uptight about these things. Yeah. It's not that serious. You can actually change your leaders very, very peacefully and bring another one, fire that one if you don't want, and nobody should die for that. It's happening all over around the world, and stability is there. UK is a very stable country. You don't have people displaced because 2 prime ministers have fallen in quick succession. Same to Senegal. Look at Senegal, and they've had a very similar kind of problem that we have, well, if we can call it a problem, where the president and his deputy, or in their case, president and prime minister, fall out. But nobody dies. There are not these things of sounding as if it's the end of times. There are no end times. And for the time, Yvonne, that we are going to have a peaceful transition like we had in 2002, the better for the country. It normally ends so well. I remember in 2002, 2003, when President Mwai Kibaki from the opposition took over from former President Daniel Arap Moi, from a party that had ruled for 40 years. And by the way, nobody died at Uhuru Park that day. The country moved on quite well. We need to rediscover this maturity because we have it as a country.
No, Yvonne, this week, the Kofi Annan Foundation released what they call the Electoral Vulnerability Index. It looked at countries that face the greatest risk of election-related violence. Now, Kenya featured prominently in that report at number 2, behind Nigeria, with 84% likelihood. Now, this report is not saying that Kenya will definitely experience election violence, but a risk assessment is not a prediction. But it is an early warning.
Yeah.
And what was interesting was why Kenya was flagged. The report talks about political polarization. It talks about declining trust in electoral institutions. It talks about youth vulnerability. It talks about the history of election-related violence. And Yvonne, when I look at these indicators, I was thinking, what you just said, haven't we been discussing exactly these issues over the last few weeks? We have spent weeks discussing goons. We have discussed violence at political meetings. We have talked about allegations of voter bribery. These are the exact same things that have been mentioned in this Electoral Vulnerability Index.
So they're not telling us something we don't already
We don't know. And these are not isolated events.
Yeah.
They are warning signs. For instance, Kalou is much bigger than just that one parliamentary seat from what we have seen. Of course, a political test for president and regard the political test. Yvonne, this should not be taken lightly. And when you talk about goons disrupting in political meetings, it actually becomes a discussion about who controls violence in Kenya. The events that we witnessed over the weekend were disturbing. What we saw in Nyahururu, how that meeting was disrupted. What we saw in Kisumu, how these groups in broad daylight carrying weapons, openly marching towards a church where opposition leaders were attending a service. They were not hiding. They walked openly, confidently. Of course, there was the other group now that was at the church, outside the church, and they were confronted, and there was this whole confrontation. I think that image should concern every Kenyan. It's a dangerous place for any democracy, Yvonne, where we've had the government consistently denying that they are sponsoring or protecting such groups. You have the police also saying the opposition being accused by government as being behind it. Then there should be investigations done, because names are being thrown left, right, and center about who is responsible. Then why don't you arrest someone if there's evidence to show that so-and-so is responsible? But one clear fact is that these groups are operating with increasing boldness. One clear fact is that they no longer seem to be afraid of cameras. They don't care about CCTV footage. They don't worry about being identified. They don't care. Criminals normally don't want to be seen. Wanataka kujificha. But these groups seem to be very comfortable about being seen. That is Irungu Kangata's driver. Even if we broaden this a bit more and just not confine it to politics, there's actually a worrying trend of ordinary criminality. I'm giving you an example of a gunman walking into a hair salon and terrorizing customers.
Yeah.
Another one attacks diners in a restaurant. In Samburu, bandits reportedly attacked a village that only hours before the Interior CS had visited. 4 people were killed. These may all seem like they're different perpetrators, but for an ordinary Kenyan, it creates the same feeling that is insecurity becoming more visible? People are beginning to ask, are criminals becoming a bit bolder? Let's not just look at this as political. Let's look at it as a bigger issue about security or lack of it. I was looking at a statement by IEBC that was released maybe an hour or so ago.
Yeah.
They had written that by around 3 p.m., the turnout had been over 50%.
Yeah.
And of course, now I'm sure the numbers will go higher by the time they give us the total number after 5 p.m. when the polling stations closed. But the number was really high. And we saw it from the polling stations. We saw even the sick being carried into the polling stations to vote and taken back. We saw older people, old men and women being escorted into the polling stations to vote and come out. I think the amount of attention Kalou has gotten in the past few days may have contributed to this in one way or another, Yvonne. As we always say, all eyes have been on Kalou. In fact, this doesn't, at some point, it did not look like it was simply an election to replace the late member of parliament of Kalou. In fact, if you ask most people who the other candidates were, I think there were 9 in total, don't even remember their names. You just have the 2 now, the UDA and the DCP candidate, because the amount of attention and campaigns that went on. Because this whole thing was a competition between President William Ruto and former DP Rigathi Gachagua over who is strongest, politically strong in central Kenya. So we saw a huge voter turnout. And remember, before all this, there was a whole issue about violence. There was a whole issue of over 1,000 police officers being deployed to Kalou and all the hulabaloo that caused in terms of why so many of them. There's a whole thing today we saw about kuchunga kura. We saw tear gas being deployed, especially in the early afternoon. Morning hours, the voting was relatively peaceful. People were voting and leaving the polling stations, even with the huge crowds. It moved on pretty fast. Then things started changing in the afternoon, when strange, dark V8 vehicles started appearing in the city center. And wananchi wako pale, and there was a confrontation. There was tear gas being lobbed. There were journalists who were attacked. Statements have come from Nation Media Group, because their journalists were attacked, from the Kenya Editors Guild, from Center for Multi-Party Democracy, about why journalists are being attacked while doing their jobs, which is covering the by-election. And that is a concern. If the voting was peaceful in the morning, we have 1,000 police officers being deployed. But why are we seeing what we were seeing in the afternoon? In terms of who is this who is attacking people? Who are these who are lobbing tear gas? Who are these who are trying to gain access into some of the polling stations? Kiasi cha kwamba the residents themselves were the ones who were repelling them and refusing them to enter. It reached a point where the residents were stopping vehicles from entering some of these places, asking people to identify themselves. We saw images of police officers being forced to open their bags so that they could see what was inside. There were fears that there was money in there to bribe voters, and they were just clothes. But you see, there's that fear that people had that hapa pengine kura inataka kuibwa, and we are here to make sure that does not happen. So it was an uneventful morning, but a very eventful afternoon coming into the evening to when the polling stations were closed. But then after that, from 5 p.m. now, when the counting started, it's been calmer. We've not had cases of any violence or tear gas, any of that. I think maybe because from earlier indications, from as early as an hour and a half after polling stations closed, there were indications that the DCP candidate was doing really well. As you have seen now, there are celebrations all over town, those who are supporting the candidate. Despite IEBC not having officially declared him the winner, all indications are DCP may be getting its first member of parliament through the candidate. So Yvonne, it's been a long day. It's been a day of mixed events, peaceful in the morning, chaotic in the afternoon, and also calmer in the evening. I think which is better than what a lot of people had expected, looking at the build-up to the by-election, especially what happened in Nyahururu during the rally by the Ulinda Mwananchi team, where there were attacks, there were injuries, and there were all sorts of chaos and hulabaloo that was witnessed. I think for most people of Kalou, they're just glad that this is over. And that they're just glad that the candidate, that majority of them wanted, Usami Douglas Kamau Waweru, is a new probably member of parliament elect for them. Because ultimately, Yvonne, the whole thing is nani atakuwa mjumbe wa Kalou? Who will be that member of parliament who will represent them? Who will be the member of parliament who will work in their best interest? And I think the voters have...
There was a very famous or infamous meeting that was called by government. There was CS Interior then. Yes. You remember who it was? It was Fred Matiang'i. There was PS Kibicho. There was CS ICT, Joe Musheru. And there are a series of other senior government officials. In that meeting, it was also attended by the Chief Justice then. She was new, Martha Koome. And that meeting was supposed to prepare for the election of 2022. Wafula Chebukati then, the late, may he continue resting in peace, was also in attendance. But he was there to advise this team on what needs to be done as we prepare for the election. I think it was about this time, a year to the election. And that meeting, it was hush-hush. But the chairperson then came out and issued a statement and said, this is how the meeting went. Based on the position of the commission, we cannot continue to take part in that meeting because the role of preparing for elections is purely the mandate of the IEBC. And
it was an ad hoc committee of sorts that had been created,
And it brought a lot of heat. And CJ Martha Koome then was supposed to be chairing.
How?
I highly doubt she elected to chair. She must have been picked for certain reasons. Now, that is recent history. It's only 4 years ago. IEBC cannot forget such kind of things. They have people in the secretariat who have walked this journey. They know what happened. They know why there were questions in 2022. And in as much as the Supreme Court was able to clear that election, there was a dent in the perception. May I remind you that post that, we had the Cherera 4 team splitting from the rest.
So
after that, they resigned. One of them was removed by a tribunal. Thereafter, there were demonstrations in this country.
So that confirmed many of the fears that some Kenyans had.
And you remember those demonstrations also happening because there was a new process of picking new commissioners that the opposition then led by the late Raila Odinga was also feeling that it was not as inclusive. So these problems cannot keep repeating themselves. So yes, consult, exchange documents, exchange meetings. I remember there's a time there was a meeting that was held, I think it was the same commissioners. They attended a certain meeting with a senior government officer. I think it was at Harambee House.
I remember that.
And it brought a lot of noise again. So those things, the commission has to be very sensitive because we are getting into a very sensitive period. Let me say why. The next thing after all Kalou, by the way, you cannot conduct a by-election to replace an MP or an MCA after February next year. Because you cannot conduct a by-election 6 months to the general election. But the next steps will involve IBC preparing for the election. There is procurement to be done. What are they procuring? There will be a procurement deal for ballot papers, election technology, who is supposed to supply what? Be they the polling booths, and the polling booth is that carton box you saw being carried, the very big one, There will be ballot boxes if they need to replenish what they have. Obviously, we're expecting more than 50,000 polling stations. I think last election was about 46,000. So all that procurement is a lot of work. And if you remember the election of 2017, it was very heated. We were not sure we were going to have ballot papers for the presidential election up until the final 2 weeks of July as we were leading to the election. You may recall that the procurement of ballot papers for all the other seats was done and printed in Dubai by Al Ghurair. And then we had to wait for a judgment of the Court of Appeal. You may also recall that there was a question about returning officers. Remember a High Court that nullified the recruitment of returning officers?
Yes.
Which was saved by the Court of Appeal, which was also headed by who? Chief Justice Martha Koome. She was then the Judge of Appeal.
Yes.
Now, all those things is what it means to have dented confidence in an electoral body, IEBC. So IEBC should not be distracted. They should not be showing up at press conferences with other institutions, if you have to talk about the National Police Service, because they have so much work to build confidence in their stakeholders. When this political class now is also speaking, they also have a duty of care. They have a duty, what do you call it? They have a duty of responsibility that whatever they say, unless it is something that they can actually back with evidence, there are certain things that this country cannot entertain. Because when you discredit an institution and a process without evidence, then what exactly are you doing? You're just setting this country for crisis. So we can only hope that moving forward there will be sobriety from all players in this election, but knowing too well that there's a higher responsibility on the side of IBC and hoping that they will do everything that they should to ensure that we have at least the process itself. Because free, fair, credible, and so many other adjectives there is a huge responsibility for IBC to ensure.
Gadi versus RUTO?
It is a contest of egos, political egos, and bruised egos at that. President William Ruto and his former deputy Rigathi Gachagua have for some time now, been fighting a long war of attrition, political attrition. And this will go way into the political calendar of this country, including next year's election. But the political scene in Kenya is full of ironies. Remember that in Kalou constituency, there is a little ward called Ruri ward, which actually was ironically the first battlefield between former Deputy President at the time, William Ruto, and his former boss, Uhuru Kenyatta. So Kalou is such a special place when it comes to some of these battles that we have seen in recent times. And remember, UDA won its first seat there. That's in Ruri constituency, in Ruri ward. Then there was Kiambaa with Kawanjiko, who became the first member of parliament of UDA. UDA being the new vehicle of the then Deputy President William Ruto, who was at odds with his boss Uhuru Kenyatta. So, having been elected on Jubilee and having really fell out with President Kenyatta, Ruto basically started preparations for another political home, and he called it the United Democratic Alliance, UDA, and won those two seats. Now, look at how it's shaping up again here. Gachagua Rigathi, who was deputy president, falls out with his boss, William Ruto, and is impeached, is now out there. And there are two races that started shaping their fights. The first one was Mbere North, which was perceived to be part of the stronghold, of the Mount Kenya stronghold of Rigathi Gachagua, that President Ruto and UDA won. And today there was Kalou. And looking at the numbers, if you could just look at some of the polling stations that have been posted by the IEBC, there is a landslide, basically a very decisive outcome in favor of DCP candidate who is in Rigathi Gachagua's party. So here is the contest of political egos, and as at now, the number, now we're in the football season, it is President Ruto 1, former Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua 1. Let's take a water break. Don't do it.
Hydration break.
You know, and what you said is interesting, because I don't think anyone feels safe with the goon culture that we have in the country. If you're in Westlands on General Madenge, you're vulnerable. If you're in a church at All Saints, you're vulnerable. If you are at a polling station, you're vulnerable. The goons are everywhere, so it doesn't matter where you are, it doesn't matter your class in society. This is something we're creating. And yet, like you say, all those who are charged with this, the responsibility of keeping us safe and getting all these goons, either make assurances that seem hollow, or don't seem to know what's happening, or are very categorical one moment saying they know who these guys are and who is their sponsor. But then when told, okay, now put your money where your mouth is, stay where you are. But what does all this portend for 2027?
You know, when you talk about goons and what we see, but I also think about what our leaders say every time they're in these meetings. Even that ni kuchochea. And that also worries me. But you ask about the IBC. We need to look at the position it finds itself in. Yvonne, you know, we need to remember one thing, that IBC has inherited the trust deficit that Kenya has in the electoral body and election in itself. I mean, for almost 20 years, almost every election has ended with one side questioning the credibility of the Electoral Commission. We remember 2007. We remember 2013. Remember 2017 when the Supreme Court nullified a presidential election for the first time in Africa. We remember in 2022 where 4 commissioners publicly rejected the presidential results announced by their own chairperson. So by the time this new commission came into office, many Kenyans had already lost confidence in the institution itself. That's why this Kalou was very important, because it is one of the first real opportunities for this new IEBC to start rebuilding that confidence. So there was a very strong statement that was issued by the IEBC, and I think we played that by the chairman, talking about warning about voter bribery, warning about violence, that it could postpone the election or it could disqualify candidates. There was two politicians who were fined. Those are very strong words, but then the obvious question is, so what about all these offenses have been committed? So where is the enforcement? It's important to understand that the strength or the Electoral Commission in itself will be ultimately judged by its actions, not any press statements that it makes. If there's evidence of voter bribery, who has been arrested? If there's evidence of violence, who has been charged? If there's evidence that candidates have breached the electoral code, has anybody been sanctioned? And that is where credibility is built. not through warnings, there has to be some form of enforcement. And I think that is a challenge that's facing these commissioners. People want to know whether this commission will simply document electoral offences or whether it will actually act. You cannot protect elections by making press statements. You can only protect elections by institutions that are prepared to enforce the law. You need without fear or favor. You should not be afraid or anything. What else I find interesting is that maybe our problem as Kenyans is not about personalities, because these are new commissioners. It's institutional. So we need to build an electoral commission whose credibility does not depend on who chairs it. It doesn't depend on who it is. You look at IBC as a body and you believe it's credible. So justice must not just be seen to be done, it must be done. And that's what elections look at. You want to hear free, fair elections. They must also be seen to be free and fair. You just don't say they're free and fair. And people need to have that confidence, Yvonne. Because I keep remembering something. In 2022, the lead up to the elections, the EACC had documented, I think, a list of almost 300 potential candidates who all were flagged for one reason or another. Right. There were some who had cases. There were some who were flagged for corruption. There were some who were flagged for having bogus education documents. But almost all of them were cleared by IBC to run. Some of them actually won, and they're serving after already being flagged by EACC. Such things matter. So things need to be done the right way. Institutions should speak out, use the powers that have been given to them by the Constitution, enforce the law, punish people who need to be punished, so that when people hear about the IBC, they believe that their vote matters, they believe that the election will be free and fair, and they believe that the leaders will be ultimately chosen that the ones who the people wanted, the will of the people.
And you were saying it's not just about statements, but it's also action. But I also believe it's optics. And this commission needs to be very clear about the independent part, and not just being independent, but appearing to be so. I'm a little concerned by the press conference that they had in the lead up to the by-election today, where they were, giving an update on the preparations and everything that's happening. It's not always a good look to have the IBC flanked by the Inspector General of Police, his 2 deputies, plus, the whole of, the senior police, senior members of the police service. You will recall that, again, with IPOA, the gentleman who is now, I believe is now in the judiciary, Ahmed Isaac Hassan, he was the head of IPOA at the time, holding a press conference standing right next to the Inspector General of Police. Those are things that cost him, and he did apologize for it some time after. They must appear to be independent. We've seen this again with the judiciary and the executive. All of these are very important. Words tell something, but so do pictures. And for them to be doing this together, and then it is there where, you've got an announcement that this is what we're going to be doing in terms of security, and anybody who attempts anything, we're going to deal with you, because nowadays, this is how we talk to each other in this country. We'll deal with you. There's a crackdown. This is, we don't talk with each other. We talk at each other. And it's always from a position of threats. I think it is very important that the commission chair and the entire commissioners, completely remove themselves from any other institution that people might then infer, wrongly or rightly or otherwise, that there is something going on here. And they've got a lot of work, like you said. They've inherited that. And no matter how much they try to complain, it is what it is. There is a history in this country. Sam.